When I was about 6 or 7 years old, I used to spend a lot of my time at a friend's house being babysat by his mum. I remember that one time I was watching TV and happened to glance up at their VHS collection on a shelf. My attention was suddenly and inexplicably grabbed by two particular videos. Now, I took a closer look at both of them and saw that they were videos of an animated show, and there was something about them that made me curious. Now, when the mum came in and I asked about them, she told me that they came from a car boot sale and that they hadn't been watched for years. Consequently, these two videos were given to me to keep. This animated show, it was called The Time Fighters. Now, The Time Fighters was originated in Japan under the title Tamu Boken, or Time Boken. I've looked up the translation, and in this context, Boken refers to the mother ship in which the characters travel through time, which in turn was called the Time Boken. So Time Boken refers to the time mothership, so a time machine, basically. So Tamu Boken, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, was shown on Japanese TV back in the mid-70s and was dubbed into English and renamed The Time Fighters for American home video somewhere in the early 80s. There were originally about 60 different episodes, but for the English version, only selected episodes were edited together to basically make a TV film. Now, I'm only going to be talking about the English version here simply because it's the version that I grew up watching, so I understand the characters and the story a lot better. But if you want to learn more about the original Japanese version, there is tons of information about it on the net. The story is basically about a couple of young teens, a boy called Jet and a girl called Star, who travel through time trying to find Star's grandfather, an inventor called Professor von Spock.
Fascinating.
Who, after testing a time machine that he invented, gets lost. The time machine, which is called Scorpion 2 in this version, is sent back to Jet and Star, and they use it to go and find him. Jet and Star are accompanied on their adventures by a robot called Tonk and a small bird called Squawky, who, incidentally, is also lost and is trying to return to his wife. Yeah, it's true that the series does look like anime, but when I was very young, I didn't know what anime was. I just thought it was this weird but cool looking series. This was also before I was familiar with the concept of time travel, so I didn't know about Doctor Who or Back to the Future, etc. So Time Fighters was basically my introduction to time travel. I think the series is aimed at the younger generation of children, so it actually does a good job of explaining the concept of time travel without going into too much detail. It focuses mainly on travelling to different time periods and locations and leaves out the more complicated time alteration storylines like we see in Back to the Future, for example. The series also has an educational aspect, particularly when it comes to meeting several historical figures and fictional characters. For example, I didn't know who the Wright brothers were until I saw The Time Fighters. The humour is easy to understand as well. It was clever writing, but I was still able to laugh at it even at a young age. For example, there's this line at the very beginning where we learn why the time machine is called the Scorpion 2 and not the Scorpion 1. It turns out that the professor simply decided to invent the Scorpion 2 because he didn't want to waste the time. Now, I thought that was quite clever even when I was 7 years old, although shouldn't that create some sort of paradox? I mean, if he didn't want to waste time, then why didn't he invent the Scorpion 3 instead of the Scorpion 2, or the Scorpion 4 instead of the Scorpion 3, and so on? One thing I really loved about this series was the way it all looks, especially the characters. As mentioned, I didn't know what anime was at the time, which is why the character design was a little unusual to me. But I still thought everything looked really cool, particularly Tonk the robot and the outfit that Jet wears. Both Jet and Star wear these weird helmet suits with stripy boobs on their heads. To a 7-year-old, these outfits look really spacey and I wanted one. Although, is it me or does Jet look a little bit like Mega Man? I also love the designs of the time machines. The Scorpion 2 was a basic design, but it still looked really cool with the wings that would open up when it flew and that rotary weapon at the front. There were also two other time machines that we used, a grasshopper and a stag beetle. I don't remember if these machines had names or not, as they weren't used as much as the Scorpion 2. There are villains in the series, and actually they provide most of the comedy. We have Captain Arrow, who reminds me so much of a classic villain from a silent film. He has an angular face and a long curly moustache. Then there's Mungo. He's short and muscular, and he always has this huge grin that looks really uncomfortable, like his gums are stuck like that or something. Arrow and Mungo are led by a female villain by the name of Lucina Skullduggery. Lucina was basically my first TV crush. I mean, just look at her in that tight black outfit and that long flowing hair with the midriff showing. Well, whilst Lucina was the leader of the gang, she actually did very little work. She would basically just lie seductively on a couch and give orders to the other two, but just look at the way she's lying. God, she can give me orders any day. The Time Fighters travelled to so many different time periods. The Stone Age, the ancient Incas, a futuristic society where robots rule the planet, and even to Transylvania where they meet Dracula. There was also a continuation of the series called The Time Fighters in the Land of Fantasy. This was where the Time Fighters travelled into fantasy time and met with several different characters from fairy tales like Snow White and Little Red Riding Hood. The clever thing about the fantasy series was that the Time Fighters were written in to fit with the familiar storylines. So when they meet with Cinderella, for example, they play the role of the fairy godmother and take her to the ball. Another one of my favourite things about the series was how each adventure would climax with a one-to-one fight between the Time Fighters and the bad guys. You see, everywhere the Time Fighters went, the bad guys would always create time machines of their own and follow them. I must admit, every time machine the villains created was very imaginative and had its own creative weaponry. My personal favourite was the ape. It would pull these huge symbols out of its nipples and crash them together, making everything come crashing down. So each time machine would go head-to-head in a giant battle. It was kind of like Power Rangers when the Megazord would form up and go up against a giant monster of the week. Now, obviously being from Japan, this also references all of those Toho monster battles like Godzilla vs. Mothra and King Ghidorah and so on. For a kids' series, the battles were actually quite intense, and as mentioned, the weaponry was very inventive. There was one fight scene, for example, where the villain's time machine was a huge bear. There's a scene where the Time Fighters are thrown against the side of a cliff and the bear pins them down using grinding spikes on its back. I think the animation and the graphics were quite impressive for the time. I particularly like the weird effects when the time machines are actually travelling through time. It's very trippy, especially with the otherworldly sound effects. One thing I didn't really like or understand was the musical interludes. Every so often, without any kind of lead-in, there would be a song thrown in at random. The songs weren't sung by anyone in particular, but they would accompany some strange dance sequences, often from the villains. It was very unusual and out of place. There are a lot of other moments that don't really make sense, and there are also a lot of technical issues, like when the dubbing of the voices doesn't quite fit.
Bye!
One particular issue I did have with the series was the terminology that was used. As a 7-year-old, I would sometimes get confused by words like time era and main starboard stabilizer. I remember I would use words like that in the playground and my friends would wonder what the hell I was talking about. For the time it was made and for the target audience, the Time Fighters was very ambitious and creative. One could argue that it was maybe a bit samey, in that each adventure would see the Time Fighters travelling somewhere, meeting new people, and then fighting the bad guys at the end. But I think this is just what kids of a certain age wanted back then, which is probably why Power Rangers became so popular. I did enjoy watching the Time Fighters again, despite that I'm now old enough to pick out the more obvious of the problems. I was also still able to remember how I felt when I watched it as a kid. I do admit, though, I did find myself laughing at the outfits this time. They do look ridiculous, and I can't understand why don't they just change occasionally? They're always wearing the same thing. As an adult, I can also see how rushed the editing is. The sequences are all stuck together very hastily, and everything kind of gets wrapped up very quickly. When the series comes to an end, it literally just stops, and there's no climax. The villains, they don't die or get locked up or anything. They just sort of stop and go away, and the next thing we see is Star and the Professor together, and the narrator simply says that that's the end. It's very underwhelming. I do appreciate that there is probably a lot that has been edited out to fit the English dub, and there must be a lot of episodes I haven't seen that explain the story better. One thing I haven't done yet, which I would be interested in doing, is watching the original Japanese episodes of Tamu Boken. Hopefully I can find episodes that are subtitled so I can understand the plot. So, do I recommend The Time Fighters? Well, while it is aimed at the much younger generation, I would still recommend this to older folk simply as a fine piece of nostalgia, particularly to those who, like me, are admirers of Japanese anime or, as I said before, the old Toho fighting monsters like Godzilla. There is something from that perspective for older viewers to enjoy, particularly when it comes to the highly creative Time Machine designs. The humour is also quite enjoyable, especially coming from the villains, who basically are homages to the Three Stooges. Look, I won't go as far as saying that there's something for everyone in this series, but if you enjoy a good nostalgic piece of Japanese monster robot fighting occasionally, and you're willing to put up with some bad editing and dubbing, then I would suggest you at least take a look at the first part of the story. It's a silly bit of time-travelling fun, and it has an awesome theme tune.